Hello, and welcome back to Let's Get Lit. In today's episode, we're going to be going over Part 3, Chapter 5 of George Orwell's classic, 1984. Alright, we have been through some really heavy stuff the past few chapters. We are almost close to the end. Let's see how this penultimate, which means second to last, chapter is going to happen, shall we? This chapter starts out with Winston stating that pretty much the entire time he's been in prison, throughout the different stages, he's had a vague idea of where he's at in the building due to the atmosphere. When they first brought him in, he was in one of the lower levels underground, and when O'Brien was torturing him on that bed, he was high towards the top due to the pressure. Winston goes on to tell the reader that in this room, it was a white cell that was much larger than what he was used to, and he was strapped into a chair where every single inch of his body was strapped down, and he was unable to move in any way, shape, or form. Winston says that inside of the room, there were two tables, each about 2 meters wide, one just a few feet in front of him and the other further back towards the door. O'Brien speaks to Winston and states, "You asked me once what was in room 101. And I told you, you knew the answer already. Everyone knows what is in room 101, and it's the worst thing in the world." At that moment, on the very far table, a guard comes in carrying something made of wire that looks like a box or a basket, and he sets it down on the table. Winston could not see what was in it because O'Brien was standing in the way. O'Brien goes on to state that the worst thing in the world varies from person to person. It could be burying alive, it could be death by fire or drowning or impalement. There's so many different deaths. But then he says sometimes those aren't even the worst case, and it's actually something quite trivial, not even fatal. O'Brien moves out of the way and Winston can see better what's on the table. It's an oblong wire cage with a handle on top for carrying. Fixed to the front of it was something that looked like a fencing mask with a concave side outwards. Even though he was still far away, he could see that the cage was divided lengthways into two counterparts, and there was some kind of creature in each of the counterparts, and those creatures inside were rats. O'Brien goes on to state that the worst thing in the world for Winston is rats. Winston screams out, "You can't do that. You can't do that. You couldn't. It's impossible." O'Brien reminds Winston of all the strange dreams and terrifying nightmares he's had over the past 7 years about being in darkness, but something close to his face and scurrying around were rats. Winston begs that it's not necessary and asks him what he needs him to do. O'Brien does not answer him directly, and instead, O'Brien acts as if there was an audience behind him and he addresses them. O'Brien states, "By itself, pain is not always enough. There are occasions when a human being will stand out against pain, even to the point of death. But for everyone, there is something undurable, something that cannot be contemplated. Courage and cowardice are not involved." O'Brien states that Winston will do what is required of him, and Winston states, "But what is it? How can I do it if I don't know what it is?" O'Brien picks up the cage and brings it across to the nearer table. He sets it down, and as it's closer to Winston, Winston can carefully see what the thing truly is. What he realizes is that it's a type of torture device, where the face shield will be put around Winston's head, and at the very command of O'Brien, the two flaps will open, allowing the rats to fully go in and destroy Winston bite by bite. As Winston is realizing this, O'Brien explains it to the pretend audience behind him. After this, he then picks up the cage and brings it closer to Winston's head. There's a sharp click, and Winston tries desperately to tear himself loose from the chair, but it was hopeless. As O'Brien is bringing it to Winston's head, he tells Winston that he has pressed the first lever, which will allow for him to slip the contraption over Winston's head. He then goes on to torment Winston and provoking the fears that he has for rats. During this moment, he is desperately trying to think of a way that he can get out of this situation. There must be somebody who can take his place instead of his. As the mask is being closed in on his face, he realizes what he must do. And then he screams, "Do it to Julia. Not me. Julia. I don't care what you do to her. Tear her face off. Strip her to the bones. Don't do it to me." At that moment, he feels like he's falling backwards because O'Brien is taking the trap away from him. He knew in that moment he did exactly what O'Brien wanted him to do. This is the end of Part 3, Chapter 5. Join us in the next video as we find out what happens to him and the end of 1984. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, stay lit.